Hi, and welcome to our Regent Redux event, Freedom in the Busy, brought to you by Regent College and our presenting sponsor, Christianity Today. I'm Paige Gutacker. I'm a Regent College student, and I'll be your moderator today. We have an excellent panel lined up for you featuring Anne Voskamp. You know Anne as an author, a blogger, and she's also a mother of 6. She's tuning in today from Ontario. So glad to have you with us, Anne.
It's a grace to be here. Thank you, Paige.
Next, we have Bruce Hindmarsh joining us from Vancouver. Bruce is a church historian and our very own professor of spiritual theology at Regent College. Bruce, it's a pleasure to have you on the panel.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Finally, we have Mark Buchanan. Mark is an author, he's an educator, and he's a former pastor. He's tuning in from Alberta. Mark, so glad that you're here.
Paige, it's a real be part of this.
Let's jump right in. Mark, I want to ask our first question of you today, and it's a big question, but I thought it might just help us get into the topic together here. So the question is, what is Sabbath?
Yeah, Paige, it's such a great question because to get clarity about that is the way to frame and enter into this whole discussion. In the book I wrote on Sabbath, I have a simple definition. I say Sabbath is when we imitate God in order to remember that we're not God.
Mm.
Now, I would expand that a little bit, and I would say that Sabbath is God's gift and God's command for us to come back to ourselves. It's a real gift to reclaim our humanity and our identity in Christ. And the way I would ground that is in the Sabbath commandment itself, the 4th commandment. There's 2 rationales for the Sabbath commandment. In Exodus, which goes all the way back to the creation, and the other in Deuteronomy, which goes back to the Exodus experience. It says, you used to be slaves, but I got you out of that. In other words, Sabbath is a reminder of the big story of whose we are. It's a reminder that we're created in the image of God, His breath breathed into us, and it's a reminder of the redemption of God, that when we got into slavery, He rescued us out of that. And so I really think it's this gift of bringing us back to ourselves, or a gift of bringing us back to who we are and whose we are.
That's beautiful. That's going to stick with me throughout the broadcast today, even your starting words, when we imitate God in order to remember that we're not God. Thanks for that launching off point. Before we go too much more with the theology and the background of Sabbath, I wanted to actually turn to you, Anne, and ask you just a practical question. When and why did you start practicing Sabbath in your own life?
I think we're called to live an uncommon, broken way in the world, because really this is what brings wholeness. And one of the ways we live subversively and an alternative way is to practice Sabbath, because I think our society is increasingly anxiety-ridden, and the way to break this vicious cycle of consumerism and productivity and performanceism is really to press pause, a complete hard stop. Here in the country, we have these rolling stop to stop signs, and we sort of roll through the stop sign and continue on like we're okay. And I think this is how we have real life crashes, is when we just have these rolling stops as opposed to complete hard stops. When we first came to the farm, it was really tempting. We had so much work to do, and it was really easy to put in 18-hour days and to go to church on Sunday and then to come home and to keep working all of the time. And we really realized we were going to run into a life crash if we continued this way. And I think too often we think that we can practice Sabbath only if we've finished what we need to do. But really, practicing Sabbath is not because we have finished our work, but it's this subversive, radical way to say, Christ has already finished the work, and I can trust Him and rest in Him. So for us, it was this really radical decision to make as a family that putting a stake in the ground, at least every 7 days we will put a stake in the ground that we are trusting our lives into the hands of God.
That's beautiful. So this was a decision that you made as a family some years back.
Yeah, we were probably only at the farm. We've been there, what now? 18 and a half years, and probably within the first 6 months, we realized you can work 24/7 with no, where are the hard stops in our society, our culture, to say, wait, I'm going to take a pause, and exactly what Mark said, and say that I'm going to imitate God by doing what God does and proving that I'm not God. God is in complete control, and I'm not, and realizing that Sabbath really was the one gift we could not afford to refuse.
Mm. Thank you, Anne. That's a powerful metaphor, rolling stops versus hard stops.
Yeah.
Bruce, I'd like to throw a question your way about the theology of Sabbath. What is Sabbath for?
I think Sabbath is about it's about ends rather than just means. And in our society today, everything is instrumentalized. Everything is about productivity. And the question is, where's the destination rather than just the journey? Where is it that all this action terminates in rest? And I think it was Christ himself who said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest." I think Sabbath is really about responding to that invitation and coming to the Jesus Christ who offers us that deep, deep rest. So I like what Mark said about Sabbath, but I think we don't just look back to the continuity with creation and becoming more human. We also look to the new humanity, what's offered us in Christ, and the future that's broken into the present. So it's interesting, a couple weeks ago, Jews all over the world, 212 cities, the Sabbath Project, Jews were called to renew their commitment to Sabbath. And so there's a deep felt need for this. It's the same need that drives people to mindfulness practices and yoga, and how do we push back against capitalist time work discipline and all these things that are so relentless. So I think the Christian experience, that in addition to the call to recover our humanness, to recover these creational rhythms, we bear witness to the new thing. We bear witness that Sabbath is coming to Jesus Christ.
That's really awesome. So it's not just looking back and recovering our humanity, but there's a looking forward aspect as well. Tell me a little bit more, Bruce, about this future breaking into the present and how that would be connected then with what we would do on the Sabbath.
Well, it's Hebrews 4. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. There's a way that Sabbath is about the eternal Sabbath, and Sabbath is not just in the past, but Sabbath is the very picture of about the very end for which we are created, and the end that all that Christ has accomplished for us. And so it is the final goal, but then Peter says, even now you are receiving the goal of your faith. Even now this future is breaking in, and it's a cause, he says, for great joy. And I think of some of the early Christians when they're there's a letter from Governor Pliny to the Emperor Trajan, where he's describing one of the first accounts we have of what the Christians did. And he says, he writes to the emperor and he says, I've tried to figure out what these Christians do. And he said, they gather on the first day of the week before dawn and sing a hymn to Christ as God. And it's a beautiful picture of just this Eucharistic joy of these early Christians. And maybe some of them are slaves, maybe some of them are going off and they have to work, but they gather before dawn on the first day of the week to bear witness to the new thing that has come, the one who makes all things new. And I think it's that kind of witness that to our eternal rest that's breaking in even now. And this continuity, this is what we're made for, this is what constitutes a very human, creational kind of rhythm to our lives.
Paige, I wonder if I could break in for a second. I really love what Bruce is saying. And it's interesting if you sequence out the scriptures and try to kind of collate all the material together. Jesus' invitation in Matthew 11, come unto me who are weary and laden. In Luke's gospel, the story that inserts into that rough chronology is a Mary Martha story.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, we get an acted parable in the Mary Martha, or almost we can imagine Jesus opening his arms to Martha and saying, Martha, Martha, come unto me, all you who are weary and tired. And so I think to speak to Bruce's point, he's calling her as not only to a remembrance, but to an observance or an anticipation of the new humanity that is now possible through Jesus.
It's interesting, too, in light of our theme about distraction in the modern age, that he says to Martha, you are distracted with many things, right? Yeah. So even then, there's this condition as a potentially distracted condition.
Yeah, I think that's the key to that story, the comparison between the one thing and the many things.
Yeah.
And we just get bottled up. We have, you know, the modern word for it is multitasking.
Yeah.
And it creates a kind of Martha syndrome. We get worried, upset, distracted.
We've got a question here from a pastor, and maybe, Mark, you could first speak to this, but it's how do we see Christ as a fulfillment of Sabbath? What does it mean for our Sabbath practice if Christ has fulfilled it already?
Well, we have to understand fulfillment in two senses. One is that Jesus has done it completely and perfectly, and now we don't have to observe dietary laws, for instance. But the other fulfillment is that Jesus Christ now becomes a perfect being, and by the Spirit gives us grace and power to live it. So the Ten Commandments would be fulfilled differently from the Levitical law. Ten Commandments are, here is now the power that I am living the thing in a perfect expression what the Father always intended, and by the Spirit I give you now power to live it out. And so I would just simply say, look to Jesus and his Sabbath practice, which to the religious mind was Sabbath breaking. And so that's sort of a bit of a clue to how we might engage or not engage Sabbath. But Jesus said in Matthew 12, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. And so I think we have, as we look at Jesus and his Sabbath practice, because he did have a Sabbath practice. We maybe can talk about that a bit later in the program. But Jesus had a very distinct Sabbath practice. And I think we look to that and we have some very primary clues about what fulfillment might look like and how we ourselves might enter into the fullness of Jesus' own practice.
Good. I think we will circle back to that theme a little bit later. Another question that has just come in is, and in your direction, what does Sabbath look like for you?
I think if we see Sabbath as this alternative way to live, this subversive upside down way to live, this way to break these cycles of productivity and consumerism, I think it ushers in this opportunity to live out hospitality in a way that we couldn't otherwise. So is Sabbath a way that we open our door and invite people in? I think one of the best expressions of our theology is how we practice hospitality. And the practice of Sabbath allows us to practice hospitality in a way that means coming home from church. And there's a supper, big Sunday dinner that's made that we can invite people in. And I think if we're living this alternative, radical, upside-down way that practice Sabbath, that practices hospitality, it's also a way to practice justice in lots of ways, to invite people literally to the table who are forgotten, who are on the fringes and on the margins. So how do we use Sabbath? We want, so much of the time we want a sacred space to go to meet God, as opposed to seeing that all things are from him and through him and to him, that time is made to be sacred. So how do we see Sabbath as this cathedral space of time where I step into and invite people to come to the table and to feast on grace? So for our home, it means there's usually lots and lots of kids at our house on Sundays. And I think to really see that when I'm always in a hurry, I can't have intimacy. Sabbath is a way for me to go ahead and radically push back against the pressures of productivity and turn towards intimacy in terms of relationship. So inviting people to the table and spending time with people breaking bread is really what it looks like at our home.
You said so many beautiful things there. I didn't want you to stop talking. I am absolutely hung up on this idea of the Sabbath creating room for hospitality, which you said is an expression of our theology.
And so that doesn't look like whether I'm a good housekeeper or not.
Okay.
I don't mean something quaint. I mean hospitality is the best expression of our theology in terms of how open-handed are we with our lives, with our door, with seeing people not as an interruption into our days, but the manifestation of Christ into our days. So hospitality really being a mindset of openness. And I think Sabbath allows us to have this constant reset of I'm going to pause on productivity and turn towards intimacy and communion within the body of Christ and communion with Christ himself. That's what Sabbath, for us, that's what it looks like.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I wonder, Mark and Anne, whether what we don't mean is that a person can be a workaholic for 6 days, and then the Sabbath is kind of pixie dust that we spread over the week, and then everything is good again, right?
That's a very good.
It's the very things that you're talking about. The whole idea is that this begins to change the other 6 days too, right?
Exactly, Bruce. That it changes the fabric of the other 6 days. It's a complete pair.
Uh-oh, everyone. We have a delayed video feed. Bruce and Mark, are you still with me?
I'm here.
Okay. Yeah. That is an incredible image.
I think Anne is having a Sabbath.
Yeah, she's taking a Sabbath from our broadcast. Yeah. Well, as our team works to get Anne back on the line, let's continue with this conversation about what Sabbath looks like sort of very practically. For each of you, what would you say has been good about your Sabbath practice and what's been really hard?
I can say that from early on, we as a couple we feel the pressures everybody feels of being pushed toward the environment of total work, and the level of distraction that just our society time seems to have been sped up so much. But very early on, I remember Carol and I made a decision that we would never use the phrase, we would never say I'm busy, because I think one of our professors said something about busyness can be moral laziness. You know, busyness can be a kind of narcotic that keeps you from being in touch with your real life. And so very early we tried to push back against that notion. You know, when we talk about being busy, it can be a way of sounding self-important. You know, my time is really important, but it's off-putting, and it actually doesn't create hospitality to other people. And so very early we were struggling with this. How does it mean to not embrace the idea of being busy? And yet I remember when we had we have 3 children. I remember when the kids were little, somebody wrote me a note and says, "You've moved from life in the fast lane to life in the oncoming lane," and that's kind of what it felt like. You know, everything is coming at you so fast. Somebody said, time management in the modern world is a martial art. You know, and so in the midst of that, I think at different seasons of life, it's required some real creativity to know what the gift of Sabbath looks like. And so early in our marriage, when we have little kids, and you know, somehow, despite it being Sabbath, they didn't clean up their Lego on their own. You know, we had to trade off, you know, and help each other rest, help each other have a nap. Later in life, it's taken other forms. You know, try to be creative to look at what does the gift of Sabbath look like. At this season of our life, one of the real gifts of Sabbath is most Sundays stopping to have a meal with my aging parents, and just to stop, and their years of sort of their career years are over, but to pause and enjoy just the beauty of their lives, you know, and to share a meal with them. So I think it's looked different at different seasons of life, what the gift of the Sabbath looks like.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what about that Sabbath practice that you've done for these years? What about that has been hard, has been a sacrifice?
I think it does feel like it's interesting that Hebrews 4:9 talks about laboring to enter into this rest. There is a kind of struggle, and I think when you think about some of the aspects of the modern world, like it's not that people didn't work hard before. People have always worked hard, and in subsistence cultures, people are working desperately hard just to put food on the table. But I think there are some features of modern life, capitalist time work discipline, that our very economy is always moving towards total work. Joseph Pieper is a Catholic scholar who's written about how our whole society is pushing towards total work. everyone feels those pressures to be more productive and squeeze more out of every last minute. Then I think, secondly, I think technology, just the use and the technology as an environment now, it's not just a tool. And so we think of everything in terms of how it makes us more efficient, how it makes us accomplish more. And then I think the media environment and the digital environment means that time is now sped up because of the stimulus coming at us, but it's also balkanized, it's also fractured. And so I think in all of those ways, I experience what I think everyone experiences, and why there even is this felt need for Sabbath now, this new felt need among younger people, is that somehow our experience of time is destroying our humanity. And so I think there's a deep felt need for exactly what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Mark, what would you say for your own Sabbath experience? What has been good there, healing, restorative, but also challenging and difficult?
Paige, when I became a Sabbath practicer, keeper, I immediately began to be astonished at that I was always 24 hours from getting my heart back. That I didn't matter how weary, how much acedia, how much of this kind of loss of any sense of purpose to my life, that I went into a Sabbath. I honestly entered the day, received the day, basked in the presence of God, did that subversive stuff that Anne's talking about. I found that I got my heart back, and it was about a shift in an attitude of the heart, of seeing it as this. Abraham Heschel talks about the Sabbath as a sanctuary in time, or cathedral in time, or he speaks about it as eternity speaking a day. And when I began to realize that I was participating in something transcendent by just receiving and entering the Sabbath, it became profoundly restorative, and it is. And I agree with Bruce that it's not a means to an end, it's an end in itself, but it is astonishing how it does replenish us and renew us and make us more creative, etc.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting how many things that we really value cannot be simply accomplished by programmatic means end kind of thinking. Like if you think about friendship, creativity in the arts, prayer, thoughtful scholarship, the number of things that require a sense of spaciousness in one's life, these are things that we value, and yet they can utterly be crushed by a focus simply on productivity. I think Sabbath helps restore the space for that kind of thing.
Yeah. Paige, what's been difficult is, I would just simply echo what Bruce said. The power of technology is not just a series of tools, but as an environment in which we live in. I mean, it is a constant lure and pressure for me, and so I'm continually sort of putting it down, laying this stuff down, quarantining the iPhone, because the things that tie us back into that life of productivity and workaday world, and anybody knows you're one email away from your day being ruined, and so to just sort of trust that will be kept safe if I put it in a box somewhere. If I turn it off, it's not going away, it's not going to disintegrate, but I'm not going to let it be a taskmaster in my life anymore, or for this day.
Do you think, Mark, that one of the biggest Sabbath disciplines right now is ceasing from that kind of digital environment? I mean, like you, I find I have to kick my iPhone out of the room,
Yeah.
I have to plug it in another room when I go to bed. I need to take breaks from that. But do you think a digital Sabbath is one of the forms this needs to take today?
Bruce, I'd really want to nuance that. I would say more or less yes. My nuancing of it would be what we're doing right now, the technology that allows us to speak to hundreds of people from all over the world. As you are in one city, I'm in another, and Anne somewhere out there in cyberspace is in another place. Paige in another. I think this is remarkable, and I think my children don't live at home. And the idea that a Sabbath is a time to connect by this kind of technology, digital technology,
Right.
with them, I wouldn't say legalistically, no, therefore I can't. But I think in terms of the way this digital technology tends to be the main instrument through which we connect with our workaday world, and that's, I think, we need to fast from.
Right. Good. Good.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mark, you have spent many years as a pastor, and we've had a number of questions come in. What does Sabbath look like for pastors? And from non-pastors as well, the question, does Sabbath have to be on Sunday? Could it be another day?
Yeah.
Could you speak to that?
I'd love to speak to that, Paige. My wife and I, when we were 24 years in the pastoral ministry, and we tried to do Sabbath on a day other than Sunday, that beautiful reading that Bruce gave Pliny to Regent, and we found out, no, there's something about the gathered community in worship and prayer that is foundational to this practice. And what became revolutionary for us is where Jesus in Matthew 12 says, I'm Lord of the Sabbath. And he actually says, for you've heard that the priests desecrate the Sabbath and yet are considered innocent. A reference to 1 Samuel 21 and David going to the house of Noach, the priest, gives him shewbread or sacred bread and Goliath's sword. And that became a story that just opened up for us a way of entering into the Sunday where basically, and I think it was Eugene Peterson in Leap Over the Wall helped me kind of put all that together, where he talks about churches where we go for, hungry people go for bread, and defenseless people go and get a good weapon. And when I realized that part of my Sabbath practice was joining the people of God in the worship of God, in lifting our prayers corporately, but also that I wasn't doing a job when I stood in the pulpit and proclaimed, I was handing out bread and sword. And that shift in thinking made an enormous difference. I made a reference a moment ago to, I think, the magnus opus of Sabbath books is Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Sabbath. It's 125 pages of sheer rhapsody to the Sabbath. There's not a single practical idea in the whole thing, but it makes you want to keep the Sabbath. But he has these vivid images, and I've already made reference, and Anne has as well. But the cathedral in time, or sanctuary in time, and when we began to see that Sabbath is really a heart attitude, that then once we cultivate that, it has all sorts of implications about how we live our life and practice things. That was a shift that allowed us to treat Sunday mornings or Sundays as our Sabbath.
Could you help me understand cathedral in time a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, so Heschel talks about that. Most of the world, secular world, is preoccupied with what he calls it thinginess, and so we measure value is all in the concrete and the physical. And he says in Hebrew culture and in biblical culture, it's the value is in the event. It's a God who shows up. He's a God who becomes present, and these moments are marked out maybe physically, but they mark an event. And on the basis of that, he talks about how what a cathedral represents, say, St. Paul's in London, in the physical, Sabbath represents in the temporal. And so when let's just take St. Paul's, because many of our listeners would have been to something like that, or Notre Dame in Paris, where you enter into it, and it's sort of like once you enter in, you realize you're in a space that's larger than the space that it's contained within. And there's a sense of, even when I went to one of those places, I look at people who have no religious bones or leanings at all, but they become hushed and quiet and attentive and wonderstruck as they go into a place like that, because they're just responding to the sense of the sacred. And that's Heschel's image, is that this is what Sabbath is, a cathedral in time. We enter into this day, and it's bigger than all the other days. It somehow arches over them, and in the quality of the time within this day is fundamentally, radically different from everything around it.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Trying to get my head around this idea of the Sabbath as a space bigger than the day that it contains. There's really beautiful imagery there. I know our team is still working to get Anne back on the line, and I'm hoping she'll be able to rejoin us. But I think let's return to you were mentioning quite earlier on, Mark, about what Jesus did with Sabbath. What did Jesus do with Sabbath? How does that change Old Testament to New Testament? Can you help us out with that?
Well, as you know, Jesus was accused by the teachers of the law and the Pharisees as a Sabbath breaker, and this became a point of huge contention, such that in Matthew 11, after Jesus declares, "I'm Lord of the Sabbath," and then he heals a man with a palsied hand or some withered hand. Probably that man was put there by the Pharisees and teachers of the law to set Jesus up, to set a trap. And Jesus heals him anyhow, in defiance of their Sabbath regulations. And it says that the Pharisees went out from there and began to plot to kill Jesus. So apparently in the religious mind, it's inappropriate to heal people on the Sabbath, but not inappropriate to plot murder. But when I look at that, and you look at Jesus' favorite day to heal was Sabbath. Over and over he does that, and it defined the culture of the day. And he, in the context of doing that, talks about being Lord of Sabbath. So here's how I have put all of that together. I think that Jesus' Sabbath practice is a practice of Psalm 23, "I come to restore your soul," or Matthew 11, "Come unto me, and I will give you rest for your soul."
Yeah.
And I think that when we enter Sabbath, we enter it not with a sort of a sense, I've got to do 5 things to restore my soul, but with a joyful anticipation. Jesus wants to meet us in this day. He wants us to take his yoke upon us, and learn from him, and he actually wants to restore whatever got withered or bent over or palsied or fell into a ditch or a pit. We go into the Sabbath with that sense of anticipation. It comes back to what Bruce said earlier, that we're actually going in with the sense of all the days of the week, this is the one where Jesus wants to do a work in me and for me to bring me into the fullness of who I am in him and begin to reflect the new creation.
It's a kind of clue, isn't it, that Jesus wants the disciples to be fed on the Sabbath, and that he wants to heal on the Sabbath. Yes. And that what Jesus is doing in the Gospels, he's always doing. And he still wants to feed us on the Sabbath, and he still wants to heal us on the Sabbath. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that gets down to the root practices. As I said earlier, Jesus has a Sabbath practice. It's very distinct, and it's exactly what Bruce summed up. It's a feeding and it's a healing. And then I would add, because of that reference to 1 Samuel 21, it's giving us weapons, good weapons, that when we come in defenseless and we feel that we're being chased by whatever, crazy kings or board that's on our case or whatever it happens to be, that he gives us weapons not in the physical, but the way Paul describes them, that we dunamis, as power from God, is given to us. That as we enter that fray, we're not helpless and defenseless.
Mm-hmm. We've gotten quite a few questions come in about legalism and the Sabbath. So the picture y'all are painting of Sabbath is winsome and good and would be desirous to be entered into, but plenty of us have backgrounds where the Sabbath did not look like that for whatever reason, one or another. How do we avoid legalism but still enter into the Sabbath regularly? Or must we? Should we? What is that like?
Well, I'll jump in here, Paige. It struck me, I've written a book on the Sabbath called The Rest of God, and when I wrote that years ago, I looked at every reference in Scripture to Sabbath. And what struck me is that though Sabbath is foundational to covenant, so it's part of the Ten Commandments, Isaiah talks about, if you stop trampling my Sabbath, then I will restore and you'll feast in the heights, etc. That the language around Sabbath, the verbiage around Sabbath is very broad. Remember, observe, keep, keep holy, delight. So this breadth, and so there's a sense of, wait a second, God's not shy about micromanaging what we eat or what we wear according to Levitical law, but this beautiful gift and command of Sabbath, which is so foundational to our identity and in His kingdom, He doesn't micromanage. He just says, observe it. Well, what does that mean? And He says, remember it, and etc. So I think that breadth is giving us a clue in terms of, I wouldn't say you get to custom design your Sabbath, but there is a kind of a broad invitation, a generous invitation at it. And then I would come back to the account that we're just discussing about Jesus' own Sabbath practice and this restoration, this healing as part of Sabbath. So I think that we have to ask ourselves, what really is going to be the most restorative thing during this particular Sabbath? So just to give a quick example, some of the listeners right now, their marriage is in trouble. They're just in trouble. And they haven't really had intimacy, as Anne, and welcome back, Anne. It's great to see you. As Anne was talking about, when we're busy, we lose intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what if this Sabbath, Jesus is actually saying, come unto me. Are you beat up? Are you weary? Things not working? And He's actually saying this to you and your spouse, and He's making a personal invitation. Come into my space. Come into my communion with the Father by the Spirit. And I want to give you rest and restoration. I actually want to recover the intimacy that over the last 3 months you and your spouse have lost. So I think, that gets away from the legalism, but it becomes hugely practical and focused. I can't go avoiding forever this rupture in my relationship with my child or with my wife or whatever, but I'm being invited into the space, the sacred space with Jesus, that He wants to do the healing that I can't seem to find the wherewithal to do.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. And yes, indeed, welcome back. And one of the questions that we got to hear from Bruce and Mark on, but I'd love to hear from you on as well, is what has been good about Sabbath, but also a real challenge or a difficulty in your Sabbath practice?
I think really it's very easy for my identity to be caught up in what I am producing, and for my identity to be in Christ alone. I think it's always this tension between performance Christianity and present Christianity. Can I just simply be present to God? Sometimes, honestly, not working with our hands, not doing anything, is a terrifying experience. Just to calm things and to enter into simply His presence, but really we don't have anything to give to others to make ourselves the present, the gift, until we can slow ourselves down enough to simply be present to His presence. And I think at first, when we first started to practice Sabbath, that's a terrifying experience, to stop producing and simply say, I want to be present. And over time, that gets easier and it becomes this, again, the gift you cannot afford to refuse, so that you become present to Him, and then He fills you up so that you can be present and bring His presence the rest of the week into your other relationships.
Thank you for that. What would you say have been some of the fruits of Sabbath for you, but also for your family members?
I think Sabbath isn't a burden. It's this absolute joy and celebration. It becomes the pinnacle of the week, where there is the joy of the Lord. There's the coming around the table. There's the laughter, the games, the connecting, the walks through the woods, the kite out on the back lawn. Really, Sabbath becomes the celebration day where we really enter into His presence, yes, and experience fullness of joy. I just think the joy that we experience in His presence, vertically, but also horizontally, I think it's been a game changer for us as a family. We are dysfunctional on so many levels, but Sabbath has been this way to sort of reorder our own dysfunctionality towards God and reorient towards Him. And it has been this weaving together of us much closer to each other and to Christ.
That's really encouraging. And again, as you've all been doing, paints this beautiful picture of Sabbath that maybe many of us haven't had coming into this conversation. Bruce, I'd like to turn attention to you and see if you could help us turn our attention back to the past. What could we learn from our Christian brothers and sisters since the time of the New Testament until now? Is there anyone we can look to help us recover Sabbath practice?
Well, I'd like to summarize the last 2,000 years for you on Sabbath just briefly. I think it is good to have a historical consciousness, especially because one of the things about modernity is living in the modern world. There are things that are written across our lives in letters too large to read. And so some of these forces that are operating in our lives, they are so powerful and they're so englobing. And to read about other generations and their where they didn't think this way, and where repeatedly there's an awareness of entering into God's rest. So Mark talked about a 125-page book on Sabbath. I can beat that because Richard Baxter wrote 800,000 words on Sabbath, on entering into God's rest. That's like 8 times longer than my doctoral dissertation. It's a massive, laborious book on rest, but the whole thesis of the book is that there remains a rest for the people of God. There remains a rest for the people of God. We were made for this. We were made, this is our humanity, to enter into God's rest. And I'd say the thesis of the book is that we need to be sufficiently heavenly minded to give any earthly use. And that he says we need to fetch one walk daily in the New Jerusalem. We need to be people who are entirely oriented toward this Sabbath rest. Even sometimes our prayers can be instrumentalized. We think prayer is just a means of power to engage in action in the world. And of course, prayer is deeply missional, but prayer is Sabbath. Prayer is the place where it is terminal, not instrumental. It's the place where we dwell in the presence of God. It is the place, it is relational like Sabbath. It's the place where we ought to be at rest. Everything is for the sake of this. And this is a bit of eternity, and that would be Baxter's sense. The other person I have to think of when we talk about rest is Augustine's great book, The Confessions. And it's all about restlessness and rest. He begins with our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. This is not just our condition. This is the human condition, time past and time present. And then how he ends the book, most people don't get that far to the very end. The very last paragraphs of the book are about Sabbath. And it's about that work is a gift, but all of this is for the sake of entering into that eternal rest in terms of the peace that God gives. So I think all Christians would be aware that there are things that are instrumental, that are to be used and to be employed and to be treated like tools. But there are other things that are terminal, other things that are to be rested in, or in Augustine's terms, there are other things that are to be enjoyed. And that whatever practices and attitudes help us to enter into that space, this is what we were made for. It is not just about greater and greater productivity. So I think getting into these older books actually changes your mindset because people just thought differently about this than we do today.
Can you tell me a little bit more about, you said prayer is a kind of Sabbath, prayer as Sabbath. Can we go a little bit deeper with that?
Well, I think I remember once being at a conference where there was a banner at the front of the conference and it said, no prayer, no power, and it was to do with the fact that prayer is power, and prayer is powerful. Prayer is the presence of God. Prayer is effective for mission, but prayer is primarily about entering into communion with the living God, and prayer is a place where we everything is for the sake of this. This is that for which we are made. We are made to be living in the presence of God. There is Mark talked about a kind of cathedral. Well, our very lives are meant to be a kind of cathedral in which God is present, and prayer is a reminder of that. So I think there's a way that you can almost interchange the terms, that prayer is Sabbath and Sabbath is prayer, And it helps us not just de-instrumentalize our work week, but it helps us de-instrumentalize our spiritual life.
Mm-hmm.
That we are meant to rest in the presence of God. We are meant to receive the gifts that God has to give in prayer. We are meant to, it's like if there are times with my wife when we need to just sit and be quiet and hold hands and enjoy that we are in each other's presence, rather than just, in a sense, always be doing things. And prayer is about, it's as much about dwelling in the presence of God as it is trying to use God as a resource in order to get things done on our agenda. And so, in that sense, prayer is Sabbath, like very much so.
Changing directions just a bit for a question that's come in over email. We're getting the question, what about parents of small children or other round-the-clock caregivers whose work never stops? And maybe you could speak into this. Practically speaking, as a mom, not just as an employee, how do you go about Sabbath?
I think yes, I still have to feed 8 mouths on come Sabbath. I think it has to do with how much can I go ahead and press pause on. It has to do with the day before Sabbath, how much preparation can I do beforehand that creates that space. How simplified can I keep things on Sabbath so that there's downtime for the caregiver. So what can I go ahead and simplify and keep at bare minimum? It's the same thing for my husband. He has to go out to the barn and feed 1,000 sows on Sunday. So yes, that still happens on Sabbath, but what can we do to keep it at the bare minimum so that there's a replenishing and revival, so that when we come back on Monday, I have more of me to pour out. So it's the way I can function as a caregiver to make that space. Thinking, Bruce, about what you said about prayer and Sabbath, I think that is so integral and really important. For me, it was the epiphany that the only thing that kept me from prayer was idolatry, that I needed to be producing things all of the time. I needed to lay down my own idols to enter into prayer. And I think the same thing is with Sabbath also, that how much of it is our producing, sort of like building our own towers of Babel, that we need to go ahead and lay down those tools and instruments, set them aside, and simply have intimacy and communion with Him. And I think to be good caregivers, we need that space and time.
That's good.
That's good. People are also wondering, okay, so we're speaking into the family side of the picture, but what does Sabbath practice look like if you're single? And there may be that loneliness aspect, and who does this with you? Would anyone speak into that?
Paige, I'm thinking, is it Psalm 135, or that beautiful psalm that talks about the distress of various people, sailors out at sea, and storms are crashing in, and yet God brought them to safe harbor. And one of them is He put the lonely are put in families. And I'm sorry, I'm hashing, I can't remember the exact psalm. I'm supposed to be a pastor and a professor, but here I go. But I really think that part of the subversion that Anne spoke about, and how wide the table is when we're actually practicing this subversive, I love her language, upside down kingdom stuff. And the Christ who's throwing His arms open and saying, "Come to me, all you who are weary and tired." And then He says, "Learn from me." So the concept is that we're not just receiving that, but we're always in the Christian tradition. Then we become bearers of it, teachers of it, incarnations of it. So then I think that we go to all and say, "Come to me," and we make that very practical, and the table gets very wide. So I think I would just challenge anybody as part of the faith community. I tell you, the single moms especially, I don't want to exclude or be gender exclusive, but it tends to be single moms who are, I think, the most hard-pressed people right now in Western culture, and really do need somebody to invite them to the table. And I think it's an amazing opportunity for the church to actually, I get always nervous when people say we're a family here, because to some people who are not part of the nuclear family defined by Western standards, they feel alienated and leprous when that kind of language. And I think if we're using that language in a biblical sense, where the family is very large, awesome. But I think that the proof is in the pudding, and really, when we open our table, is it just a nice couple that kind of looks like us and are in the same demographic kind of, age range and socioeconomic bracket, or are we actually doing as Jesus says, when you open your table, invite, go to the highways and byways and invite people who can't pay it back, and as a really genuine celebration, not as some act of charity, but believing, and coming back to the comment about the children, believing, as Jesus says in Matthew 18, that the kingdom belongs to such as these, the little ones. And so believing it's a privilege for you, not some great beneficence on your part, but a privilege for you that you're inviting Jesus and his kingdom into your space when you invite the single parent and little child,
If I could just add one more note, I just underline everything Mark said, full stop. I think it's so important that we think of Sabbath communally and not just individually.
Yes.
But I wonder if it's also important that where Sabbath exposes our inner loneliness, we actually allow it to do that sort of work too. Because Henri Nouwen was a great one for talking about, withdrawal is for the sake of engagement, but withdrawal, stopping, actually allows us to expose us maybe some of the ways we are driven, some of those idols that we haven't laid down. And so whether married or single or, there is a kind of work that Sabbath does that it exposes some of that loneliness too, which is that's not a bad thing either.
It's so good, because I think about, we talked earlier about, quarantining your iPhone or something. Find out how addicted you are to that by laying it aside for 24 hours. And that's that exposure you're talking about.
You're getting personal now.
Yeah, well, and it's talking about Anne's, in order to pray, I had to pray or lay down my idols.
And I think it's coming to those hard stops again, where we said when we just make our decisions. Sabbath, I'm setting aside this time to pray. So at this particular time, regardless of what I think I need to produce, I am stopping and laying that down. So making a commitment at the outset that is your invitation into intimacy and presence.
Yeah. We ought not to forget that the context historically of the fourth commandment, the Ten Commandments, is these are people who are still dealing with the culture of slavery. They've just been rescued out of it, but they're still thinking like slaves. The reproach of Egypt hasn't been rolled back for them yet. And so this whole life under the taskmaster, life under Pharaonic conditions, the conditions of Pharaoh, a brutal, the total work that Bruce talked about. I mean, that's a culture of total work. And so it's just coming back. What a gift! I mean, this is a gift that Anne says you can't refuse. I mean, what an amazing word to slaves or people who are still caught up in the slave mentality. That every time they tried to rest, a taskmaster would start beating them. And now God, the God of the universe, is saying to them, "Stop! You get to stop. You shall not work." That's the "you shall not" in the Sabbath. It doesn't start out that way, but the "you shall not" part ways. You shall not work. I mean, who doesn't hear that as good news? And especially if you're caught up in the culture of Pharaoh, which I think we are.
Yeah. I sometimes when I'm asked to speak about spiritual disciplines, you get the sense that people are. It's like I'm not really in shape, and I need a personal trainer so I can kind of get buffed and kind of get fit. And so, can you give me some practices that will kind of help me get fit spiritually? And it sort of like deepens one's autonomy rather than qualifying it. And I just worry a little bit that sometimes the turn to Sabbath right now, because we all feel such a need for something different, can be like turning to yoga, turning to mindfulness practices, turning to Sabbath as something that might help me find inner tranquility, another technique something I can actually do and just jump into, but it actually leaves my autonomy intact. How do we not do that?
The Sabbath commandment says actually this is a Sabbath unto the Lord. And I think if we don't get down to that root language, in fact, I would just encourage every listener to go back to Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, read them both because there's a major variance between the fourth commandment in Exodus and Deuteronomy. So you need to read them both. And I would really just say, would you spend some time soaking and meditating on that, because I think God's going to give you all kinds of insights into his character fundamentally, but also this great gift and this great command that will do what Anne has talked about earlier, subvert, and that's what you're talking about, Bruce. Not how will this reinforce my idolatrous, consumeristic, independent practices, but how will this subvert everything?
Yeah.
While you all were talking, a question came in that I feel like you just answered and hit the nail on the head. Is Sabbath just another me day? Or if not, how is it different? And
I think that's really important, because the way capitalist time work discipline works is sovereignty. Who is sovereign over this time? My employer owns the time, and then I own my time. And leisure is the time that I own. And so it's like the little time over which, is my kingdom. And so that's another danger, not just autonomy, but that's, well, Sabbath is great because it's me time. So leave me alone. It's my Sabbath, and that would again reinforce the very thing that Sabbath is meant to undo.
Yep.
And I think that subversiveness of Sabbath and using it as hospitality, that it's not about me, but it's about inviting as many people to the table to celebrate and have communion, I think is critical.
As we begin to wrap up here, I want to get in one more question for those who are out there wondering, okay, yeah, this is wonderful and lovely, but if you just could look at my schedule, if you just knew how many pressures were on me, I start to panic when I think about carving out that time to bask in the presence of God. I just hyperventilate at that. Maybe Mark, could you close this here with, how do you speak to the objection? I just can't afford to.
I would just be very frank. You can't afford not to. Anne said this is a gift you can't refuse. And I think that you go through all the DTs. You shake out the drug and all of that of your busyness and your idolatrousness and whatnot. And as Bruce earlier referenced Hebrews 4, you make every effort to enter the Sabbath. It will be effortful. It's going to take some strategies, some working, some pushing against well-entrenched patterns. But you're 24 hours away from getting your heart back.
Take the gift. Take the gift.
Well, that's a great place to go ahead and wrap up, and this just about concludes our lunch hour as well. For me today, my key takeaways are where Mark just brought us to. I'm always 24 hours away from getting my heart back, he said. Bruce's comment to allow the Sabbath to expose our inner loneliness. Man, that pushes back against why I want to come to the Sabbath. And then Anne's invitation to slow down and be present with his presence. These lines will follow me after our broadcast today. I want to say a special thanks before we go, Regent College and to Christianity Today for making this event possible. Thank you to our panelists for offering your excellent insights into this topic, freedom in the busy. And thank you also to our audience members for tuning in and for contributing your questions. If our conversation today has made you hungry for more free resources on Sabbath, we would love to send you some. Sign up with your email at regentredux.net. This time has been helpful for you. Feel free to share it with your friends. Finally, mark your calendars for the next Regent Redux event. It'll be Tuesday, February 3rd on the topic Why Church Matters. You won't want to miss it, and all the details will be at regentredux.net shortly after the broadcast. Thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.